Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Bledisloe Lecture 2020. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. Before I go on to introduce our Bledisloe lecturer and our chairman, Jonathan Dimbleby, I would like to just say a few words about the history behind the lecture, and I have a few thanks to make as well. So the Bledisloe Lecture is one of the most important lectures in the RAU's calendar, and it was named after Lord Bledisloe, who was awarded that title after a very distinguished career in politics, and he was the High Commissioner for New Zealand. But like Jonathan, was one of our most distinguished alumni, and it can be safely said that without him, it is very unlikely that the RAU would still be here today, because after the First World War, he was responsible for helping to rebuild it. Because there's a very moving letter that was written by the principal at the time when the First World War started to the vicar of Cirencester, who said, "Will you please take care of all the records, because it may be that the college never opens again." So he obviously had huge passion and commitment to the college, and I mean, as it seemed totally fitting and right and proper that the Bledisloe Lecture should be the last in our lecture series for the 175th anniversary. But as you all know, COVID has laid waste many of our plans for the 175th. So we were able to have one lecture at the beginning given by Richard Williamson, and now this is it's right that we should be ending this with the Bledisloe Lecture. The Bledisloe Lecture had a number of distinguished speakers coming before it, and as I say, it's been a way of celebrating innovations in agriculture. This will be one of the most unique lectures though, because the audience that we've reached out to is probably larger than we've ever had before. And that's because COVID has taught us one thing, and that is that by embracing technology, we can reach out to much wider audiences than we'd ever hoped to be able to do. Thank you to our sponsors for the lecture series, which is Savills, Creed Foods and Irwin Mitchell. You've been very patient with us in our forbearance during COVID. And so what we're going to be doing next year, and I hope you'll be able to join us for those lectures, we're going to have 175th plus one. And I'd like to also thank the team who helped to prepare for the lecture, because it is as difficult to organize an online event, I'm beginning to realize, as it is to organize a face-to-face event. And thank you to the students, because we wanted this to have students at the heart of it. And the questions that have been prepared for Helen, which will be put by Jonathan, have come from the students, because obviously the students are part of the future. And the subject we're going to hear about today is very much part of that future. So I will pass over to Jonathan to introduce Helen, but it's a great pleasure for me that she's the lecturer here, because Helen really is one of my heroines. I hadn't met her before I became the Vice Chancellor, and it was Prince Charles's private secretary who said to me that I must meet Helen because she was such an inspirational figure. And I will never forget when I was able to visit her farm and to see the great diversification in the businesses and to see what she has done at home to pioneer organic agriculture. And I have to say, I've never had such acute career envy as ever else in my life, because I thought if I could live my life again, this would be what I would want to do. And it was wonderful when she said that she knew Jonathan, because Jonathan, I hadn't realized, had been past president of the Soil Association and knew Helen well. So it's wonderful that he's able to chair for us this evening. And Jonathan is, as you all will know, but maybe some of the younger generation won't remember the question times that I spent my life watching, is a very distinguished writer, broadcaster and filmmaker. And I think, Jonathan, it's right, it was 30 years which you chaired Any Questions for, as well as many other things, and being the anchoring many general elections. And I think it's allowable to say that it doesn't quite feel the same to one of my generation, that you're not still looking after Any Questions. So thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Helen. And I'll hand over to you, Jonathan, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the evening.
Oh, thank you very much. It's my real pleasure to be here, albeit remotely. My time at the Royal Agricultural College, as it then was, as you can see looking at me some time ago. It was actually 60 years, very nearly. And I had a very good time there, most of which should be forgotten, certainly not spoken about. But I did on one occasion, and I'd never written an article before. I entered an article for the magazine. And I thought I'd be somewhat provocative. So I wrote about what I called feather-bedded farmers. Afterwards, I got a letter from the editor which said, Jonathan Dimbleby, you've won the competition. I felt very, very pleased with myself. A few days later, I saw the editor, and out of curiosity, I said, how many people entered the competition? I should never have asked the question. He put up a finger and he said, 1. Anyway, it didn't quite stop me going down that road. Much later, I became, in a very modest way, an organic farmer in the 90s. And for just over a decade, as you mentioned, Joe, I was president of the Soil Association, which is organic farming's principal advocate and responsible for setting and certifying standards required to justify anyone who wants to use the Soil Association organic label to describe what they produce. For some of my time there, the chair of the Soil Association was this evening's star, Helen Browning, who is now chief executive, a post that she's held for very nearly a decade. But as you will discover, she is very much more than that as well. First and foremost, she's a farmer. She's also long been involved in issues of public policy relating to agriculture, food, and the environment. She's been a director of external affairs at the National Trust, chair of the Food Ethics Council, and a member of several government-sponsored commissions looking into the future of food and farming. She's heavily involved today still with the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission, and she's on the advisory group of the extremely important National Food Strategy. I could go on, but you've got the picture. Now, just before we start, some housekeeping. First, for some 20 minutes or so, Helen, nudged along by me, will explore some of the key issues which we're presuming are important to you. After that, we move on perhaps for 30 minutes or so to questions. First lot of these will come from students, as we've just heard, and then more widely from any one of you watching this. So if you are watching this remotely and you've got questions, please send them in via Zoom into the Q&A box that you should have. Keep them succinct. Tom will collate them and then he will put them to Helen on your behalf and we'll pick up from there. So Helen, I said you were a farmer. You have a large farm, but you're not a big landowner. You've never had a silver spoon, no big windfall from the city. You are a tenant farmer and you farm commercially in what is a challenging, has long been a challenging market. If I'm right, when you took the farm on, it was run conventionally. What made you go organic?
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, lots of things actually right at the outset. I grew up on the farm that I now run, and as a child, I could see as agriculture was changing, the wildlife disappearing. And when I did my degree in agriculture, which was at Harper Adams, boo hiss, I came across the really intensive pig and poultry sector for the first time. I was taken to these units, which were supposedly state of the art, and I was really shocked by the conditions. This was in the sort of early 80s that these animals were living in. So I became interested in the idea that there must be another way to farm, that we were going down the wrong road. And I became interested in organic farming, and I was lucky enough to do my placement when I was doing my industrial placement, during my degree, on the first project that the government funded, looking at the comparison between organic and conventional farming systems. And that was a fantastic education for me, because actually I don't think we had anything about organic farming on our degree course. I'm sure it's different now. And I learned a lot in that year, and I decided that I wanted to see just how much food we could produce, what quality of food we could produce without all the inputs that people were trying to sell me. So that's why we started experimenting when I first came back to the farm in '86, and then very quickly going all the way.
But that had to be because you could make a profit out of it, as well as living with principles that you discovered along the way.
Yes, it meant we immediately had to get involved in marketing. And there was a market for organic grain at that time, but there wasn't a market really for milk or meat or anything else. So we realized that if we wanted to farm this way, we were going to have to start selling more directly. And that really interested me too, because I didn't expect us as farmers to continue to get support from the EU for as long as we have had it. I thought we had to find a way to stand on our own 2 feet and to actually engage with the consumer and start to plough our own furrow a bit more, rather than expecting things just to be taken off the farmers' commodities and us getting paid a price and support alongside that as well. So I wanted to kind of get involved in direct marketing, and that's always been part of the package.
Now, you farm in Wiltshire on highest chalk ground. Nearly all the farms around you, because I've seen it and been there and seen them, are almost white, the soil, when in winter, and then they're sown, and they're all basically barley, arable, and a bit of grassland. Your farming is very different. Were you looked at askance by your neighbours? Here's this woman doing this.
I think I was definitely a curiosity. I mean, to start with, back in the mid-80s, there weren't that many women farming, and I was quite young. And then I had these organic ideas as well. So the package was pretty compelling. I often used to say that the farmers around the place, their necks were growing longer as our hedges grew taller, and they strained to look over to see what this mad woman was up to next. So I think it did create a bit of interest. But actually, farmers are farmers. And I always find that if farmers come and actually have a look at what we're doing, they'll get it. They might not think it's for them, but they'll get it. And our farming neighbours have been tremendous over the years. You know, it might not be for them, but they've always been supportive. Well, almost.
I want to come on to in a moment the Soil Association and its task and its role, but I want to look at the bigger picture before that. And to fast forward from when you began farming in that way 30 years ago, we live in an environment, leave aside Brexit for the moment, that is dominated by the issues of biodiversity, climate change, and the future of all humanity in that respect. Do you deep down believe that organic farming is, how can I put it, crucial to helping to solve those issues?
Well, we've certainly got to change the way we're farming. Farming is right at the heart of the problem now, and it needs to be at the heart of the solution. And that's a big shift for us to make over the next decade. We know we've got this one decade to turn the oil tanker around, really. It's probably last chance saloon for humanity to get this stuff right. So land is right at the heart of it. At the moment, we've got, agriculture and food is something like 30% of greenhouse gas emissions of our global warming potential. And it's responsible for virtually all of the biodiversity depletion that we're seeing. And we're not even feeding people very well for it. So there's from that system. So we've got to actually change quite rapidly. And I think organic farming is a big step in the right direction. And the principles of organic farming, it doesn't matter if everybody's certified organic or not, but those principles of rotational farming, of recycling nutrients, of looking after animals well, having less of them probably, but actually farming them in a different way. I think those principles are going to need to catch fire and be taken up by all farmers, even if they don't go organic as a system.
Now, skeptics, and indeed those outside agriculture, look at climate change and carbon emissions and methane emissions into the atmosphere. And as you know very well, methane is a major contributor to global warming. Livestock production is a major contributor to the increase in methane contributions in the atmosphere. Livestock production is, however, also crucial to organic farming. How do you square that circle?
It's a big circle to square, but it's a really crucial one if we're going to feed people well into the future. So I think industrial livestock farming, where we are using large amounts of land to grow grain to feed animals, is where we need to be putting the focus. If you're looking at climate change alongside biodiversity, then the place for ruminant livestock is clear. They are important in fertility building. They can be hugely important in maintaining habitats like grasslands, which really are the basis of our biodiversity system. So I think less but better meat is where we're heading. And for me, less is much less industrial livestock, animals that are eating all this grain, that are being kept in conditions which are likely to lead to antimicrobial resistance and even to pandemics. But I think the role of ruminant livestock in our countryside will be crucial for a long time to come.
Which takes us, Helen, directly to, quotes, feeding the world. 8 billion people on the planet very nearly, and steadily rising year by year. The output from organic systems, from organic output, is much lower at the moment than from conventional systems. Lower inputs, lower outputs. Another circle that has to be squared, given that at the moment organic production represents a very small fraction of total food production.
Yes, so I think there are two things to look at in particular when you're talking about feeding the world. The one I've already mentioned, which is the amount of meat we're eating, because any system, organic or not, cannot continue to feed this population if we're diverting that amount of land use and grain into livestock. And the second, obviously, is waste. We're wasting a huge amount of food as well. The yields you get from organic systems depend very much where you're starting from. In the UK, arable yields look low. They may be only 60% of the yield you might get if you're using a lot of fertilizer and sprays. But if you're looking at places like in much of the developing world, where soil fertility is the key issue you need to be concentrating on, then organic techniques can quite quickly build yield, and there's great evidence for that. So I think organic techniques have a huge role to play in helping us get this right, but it will require any change, actually, which allows us to maintain biodiversity and feed people healthily, is going to mean we need to be moving away from the very heavy use of artificial nitrogen and pesticides that we've seen over the last few decades.
Let me bring you home, or at least to the United Kingdom, from the global picture. I'm indebted to Ruth Aplin for this point that I'm going to make, who's doing an MSc in Sustainable Food and Agriculture Policy. So Kate, thank you. I'm using your question as part of my conversation here. It is estimated that food production in the United Kingdom, this is from the one of the big policy papers, land use policy documents, would fall by almost 20% if all English and Welsh farmers were to do what you would like them to do, to go farm in a sustainable way that was organic. Now, a near 40% drop in food production would cause mayhem.
It depends what crops you're looking at. As I've mentioned, arable crops, you tend to see that that kind of drop against the system which uses very high levels of nitrogen and pesticides. But if you look at other crops, the drop isn't nearly as great. One of the really interesting pieces of work that's come out over the last few years has been some modelling that a French think tank called IDRI have done across the whole of Europe, looking at what would happen if we went effectively organic, agroecological farming across the whole of Europe. And they've shown, just as I've said, that actually the key thing is it can be done. We can feed people adequately. The projected population by 2050 can be fed using those kind of techniques. But it does require us to eat less intensively produced livestock. So we're doing some modelling in the UK, which will be published early next year. And I hope that that will actually show how viable this is for the UK too.
Let's look just briefly and closer at the Soil Association's particular role. Since you've been involved with the Soil Association, output has grown, it's been hit backwards and forwards. Now, what does the growth curve of those farmers who adopt organic farming show us about the enthusiasm for organic farming?
Organic farming itself is quite static in the UK. It's drifted up very slightly over the last year or two, but really not enough, not compared to the market. So the market is growing very strongly in the UK and in a lot of the rest of the world, but we're not seeing farmers switch over and taking advantage of that market share.
Why is that? Why is that? do you think?
I think there's a whole load of stuff here. I think in the UK, it's been still not very positively encouraged. I think farmers are nervous about making that kind of switch. I think they're particularly nervous at the moment. I know we don't want to talk about Brexit, but they've got a lot of uncertainty ahead, and making big decisions, I think, for farmers at the moment is tricky. But it does complicate your life, farming in a sort of regenerative or organic kind of way. You know, you have to have livestock as well as crops usually. You usually have to build more infrastructure into the farm. There's more work involved. It's not quite as straightforward as just doing one thing. But I do see quite a lot of interest, particularly at the moment, and I hope that we will see more people going down that road. But what's exciting is not just actually the organic growth or not on the production side, but how many farmers are getting really interested in things like soils, in regenerative type techniques. I think there's actually quite a big move in the right direction from mainstream farmers now, which is really encouraging.
Okay, let's come. I'd ask you a lot more about how you might persuade more people to go organic and in a challenging environment, the impact of the Brexit talks and people's grave anxieties about what might happen for a sheep farmer in Wales, for instance, if it doesn't go less badly than it may go. The rewilding debate is familiar. It's a very but I think there's much less attention given to regenerative agriculture, maybe because that's not a particularly beautiful phrase. But anyway, the objectives are quite similar. Essentially, fundamentally saving the planet, or making the planet sustainable to live on. What's the essential difference between you, organic farmer, and you, and I know you are an enthusiast for regenerative agriculture? Is there a difference?
I mean, it's all in the same school of kind of agroecology, of trying to farm with nature better. And so, you know, I think regenerative actually seems to have really taken off as a word and a concept at the moment. And it's largely focused on soil and things like minimal tillage, using more cover crops, bringing animals back onto the system. So a lot of parallels with organic. It's probably less, unless it's regenerative organic, it's less absolute about getting rid of the pesticides and the herbicides and the nitrogen fertilizers.
And you can live with that as someone who's both a pragmatist and an idealist at the same time, if you can be. You can live with enthusiastically with the idea of regenerative farming that does still use inputs that you don't use as an organic farmer.
What we've got to do is shift the curve. We've got to shift all of farming in the right direction. Now, not everybody's going to go organic tomorrow. I'd like to get rid of the use of synthetic fertilizers largely and really minimize the amount of pesticides we use. But actually, everybody starting to farm and look after their soils better would be a massive step in the right direction. And
you are doing some regeneration yourself on your. I didn't say how big the farm is. Remind me, it's 1,000 how many acres?
About 1,500, yes.
1,500, and you're doing on part of that land. You are doing some regenerative work, which would come into this category specifically.
Well, I always think that organic is almost by default regenerative.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, the two are very. There's a lot of intersection there, but we're doing some stuff. I think there's lots of new stuff going on around organic and regenerative farming, which is really exciting. So some of the work people are doing on things like mob grazing, so letting grass mature more and then stocking it very heavily for a short period of time, sort of deferred grazing systems, that kind of thing. I'm particularly interested too in agroforestry, in combining trees into our fields, into our cropped environment, seeing trees themselves as a crop. And rather than just thinking, right, woods live over there, we plant our trees. Everybody's thinking about a lot of tree planting at the moment, and it's all about forests and woods. But actually, there's a huge scope to bring loads more trees onto farms. And that's some of the stuff I'm doing at Eastbrook at the moment, experimenting with that.
As they say in broadcasting, you've helped us segue seamlessly to our first questions without directly knowing that. And I've got some questions from students I mentioned earlier. And the first of these comes from Amanda Provençal. You're doing, Amanda, if I'm right, an MBA in Innovation in Sustainable Food and Agriculture. Your question to Helen.
Hi, thank you both so much for your time. So my question, Helen, I believe you started to discuss this with regards to the farmers and their changing attitudes, but I was just curious about the financial implications of transitioning from a more traditional mainstream farming perspective into, like you said, more regenerative or organic farming practices.
Helen.
Thanks very much. I think a lot depends, the costs depend on where you're starting from. And so it's very hard to give a sort of, a hard and fast rule. If you're starting, I was lucky when I took over the farm here, even though it was farmed conventionally, we had livestock, and so we had fencing and water and that kind of thing, which if you're starting from scratch and you've got to put all that in place, can be quite a big cost if you've got to build buildings for livestock or put all that infrastructure in. So I think the costs really do depend where you're starting from. And also what you decide you're going to do in your regenerative farming system, because there's many choices, and how you fare from a profitability point of view will depend on the choices of enterprise, what's suitable for your soils, what's suitable for the markets that you have access to. So I'm afraid it's really hard to give a sort of, a defined answer to that question. You have to work it out for every farm and every individual.
But you're not saying that every farm, that some farms can't do it, or are you?
Not at all. No, I think it's just about how you do it. And the solution will be different for every farm and every individual. Some people are doing stockless organic or stockless regenerative systems, using green cover crops, green manures, that kind of thing, if they don't want to have livestock on board. But yeah, it's just about finding the right way through. Just like people, you can't just say there's one size fits all.
You have been listening to that, it's clear, you really, you're not, farmers in general are not going, if farmers, as it were, in this sense and only in this sense, like politicians think maybe 5 years, if you're lucky, 10 years ahead, people aren't going to do it unless they have a very clear long-term sense of how important the soil is, how important it is for the next generation and the generation after. And that's quite a challenge to get that across to busy, hard-working farmers who may be getting up still, some the remaining dairy farmers and all the rest doing how they do it, isn't it?
I think it is hard, and I think particularly at a time when farmers are finding it difficult to work out what the support regime they're going to live in the next year or two, what's going to be needed, expected of them, what they're going to be paid to do. I think that makes it doubly difficult. But the old adage in farming is always live as if you're going to die tomorrow, farm as if you're going to live forever. And we do need that kind of attitude back in there. When I was talking to farmers, even 5 or 10 years ago about soils, there was still a lot of denial that soils were running into problems. I don't think farmers think that anymore. I think we've really hit the buffers, particularly in some parts of the country, with soil organic matter levels at rock bottom levels. And they're really struggling to get the yields that they were getting 5 or 10 years ago.
A very long time ago, even before I started doing my radio program that Joe referred to, one of the regular panelists on the programs, it was back in the 40s and the early 50s, was a man called A.G. Street. And he was a West Country farmer. And his stock line was, whenever on any subject in the world that came up, he said, the answer lies, he said in a West Country accent, which I won't seek to emulate, the answer lies in the soil. That sums it up, doesn't it?
I think it does. And I think farmers who are really thinking about their soils and learning about them, we're all still learning, I think, really fast, are seeing improvements in performance. And it's just crucial. It's crucial probably for climate change as well, because I think the big job we've got to do as farmers now, rather than being part of the problem, as I said at the beginning, is for us to be using techniques which are soaking up carbon and locking it back either in the soils or in the vegetation in the trees. Yeah, go on.
So just a brief comment. I remember a long time ago, I was filming in Ethiopia, in northern Ethiopia, and where the soil erosion, which is fundamental to what we're talking about in global terms, where there are tiny crust of topsoil, sometimes 2, 3, 4 inches only in depth, and I got down on the floor and there was a wind blowing on the hillside and lifted up the soil, and you could film it flying away down the valley where it would silt up a river a long way away. I want to come in. The public involvement in this is important, because public involvement involves political commitment, it involves business commitment, and it helps those who want to make the change. Claire Byers, who's doing an MSc in Sustainable Food and Agricultural Policy, your question now.
Hello, and thank you for the conversation so far this evening. It's been fascinating. Yes, indeed, I wanted to come a little bit more from the demand side of organic farming and ask you, Helen, what you consider to be the most effective ways in which the, let's face it, often cash-strapped public can encourage the transformation to regenerative agriculture practices.
I think what people can do is obviously make their voice heard. I think it's very important. We've seen that. Jonathan was just referring before we started to the Marcus Rashford campaign. You know, actually, when voices are heard, the governments do things differently. And there's no doubt what we need is to ensure that we have an economic framework which internalizes the externalities, the bad stuff and the good stuff, so that actually producing food well, its price is properly reflected. So I think that that's really important. I think just
on that one point, Helen, and then Karen, that's another way of saying that prices have to rise for food.
I think it depends what you're talking about. So at the moment, the polluter doesn't pay for a lot of the problems we cause through agriculture, and neither are farmers properly rewarded for the public goods they generate. If we could do both of those things, then you would see some things getting more expensive, and you would see some things, and I would say actually organic food would become cheaper. So I think getting that economic framework right is really important.
Because just on that organic, it's really interesting, this point that Claire just raised. You're saying that the cost-benefit analysis changes once you bring in a polluter pays principle.
Yes.
From the point of view of the farmer, and alongside that, the consumer.
Absolutely. I mean, if we looked at things like a carbon tax or a nitrogen tax that actually reflected the costs of that pollution effectively, whether it's diffuse pollution or absolute pollution in terms of manure leak or whatever it might be, then you start to encourage the kinds of farming that will stop those problems occurring in the first place.
Are you encouraged, Claire, by that?
Yes, I certainly think that chimes with the kind of things we've been learning on our course recently, and that has been talked about in the probably slightly more niche media. So yes, I think that was the kind of answer I was hoping for.
Thanks. Thanks, Claire. Joost Wetterings now, who's doing an MBA in Innovation in Sustainable Food and Agriculture. Joost.
Yes, thank you. And well done getting my name right, by the way.
I did my best.
No, so I'm very interested on the pragmatic appeal of the organics of soil association and also seeing if there's any chances of hybridize it. I talk with some of the big agricultural consultants, and I know this is something that they show a lot of interest in. And my question to you, Helen, please, are there any moves to open up accreditations by the Soil Association to hybrid forms of agriculture, and ideally incorporating part organic techniques in effort to incentivize more regenerative farming practices?
And you're thinking about a consumer-facing labels, so things that would be consumer-facing.
Yes, exactly.
Yes, so I think we are concerned about having too many labels in the marketplace, because even already people struggle to understand the difference between, for instance, red tractor and leaf and organic. So setting up, and we do have, things like leaf and some other systems which do have a market presence now. So I don't think it's necessarily about setting up more labels and schemes. But what I think would be really helpful, and one thing that we're getting very involved with, is how do we work with all farmers who want to shift in the right direction through measuring the environmental and social outcomes that they're delivering from their farming systems. So that's the approach we would rather take at the moment, to actually be helping sort of catch that data, benchmark feedback to farmers, hopefully start to release some of the new markets that are available or should become available, things like biodiversity offsetting, so that those benefits can go back to the farm rather than setting up another label at this point.
And how do you, as it were, marry what you've just described to those existing, or don't you need to those existing different labels like yours, sort of red tractor and beef and so on?
So I think all of the schemes that you've got in the marketplace at the moment tend to be very focused around standards rather than outcomes. And I think one of the things we want to do is move more towards measuring the outcomes of the farming system or the farming practices, so that we can see what's working well, learn faster together, perhaps get a little bit out of the tribes that we tend to get in terms of, are you organic or are you in this box or in that box? And say, actually, at the moment, all farmers are trying to learn really fast how to farm better, farm smarter. And if we can help do that, not through just another scheme, schemes will be important because the consumer involvement in supporting organic or leaf or whatever is very helpful. But actually in tracking what techniques, for instance, are building soil carbon fastest. How do we actually reduce antimicrobial use in animals? What techniques are working to help us get further down that road? That kind of approach, I think, is where we really want to focus our effort right at the moment.
I'm going to have to hurry through these questions. So one or two of you, I'm afraid, who've put questions, may not make it. But anyway, I'm going to go now to, because it follows up particularly on what you talked about, certification and so on. It follows up on that. It's Richard Lovemore, who's doing an MBA Innovation in Sustainable Food and Agriculture. Richard, are you ready to fire off?
Yes, I'm with you. Thanks for the opportunity. So this question is for Helen, and it leads right into it. So there's a fair number of certification bodies within the UK. And do you think that we would see more effective change from the consumers if the certification labels were all grouped together in one umbrella to reduce confusion around what each label stands for, and B, for farmers, as more certification bodies means more barriers to the market? At the end of the day, the certification bodies want to promote the sustainability, but can be seen as a hurdle for farmers to engage.
So I think it would be very helpful for us to be clear as to what the different labels out there mean, and trying to make sure that consumers are really clear about the differences. What when they see red tractor, what does it mean? When they see organic, what does it mean? I'm not sure that putting them all under one umbrella would necessarily help that. But I think the second part of your question about the barriers.
I want to stick with the first part for a moment. The Soil Association is of the organic or near organic. I mean, if you take leaf isn't organic, but it's jolly close by. You're big and powerful. You've actually, in the past, you took over, went into partnership, prefer to say, with other organisations. Are there too many organic certifiers?
Well, I mean, you could, there are several in the UK, and two big ones, us and G, that are the main ones. And I think in a way, a little bit of, if you're looking at the cost of farmers, I think a bit of competition in the marketplace usually drives down, keeps the market honest in terms of the costs back to the farm. So I think I wouldn't, I mean, Denmark has gone down a route where organic is government controlled and there's one government sponsored certifier. And that's a route you could look down. We've liked to have private standards because it means we can sometimes move on issues where governments aren't prepared to go or where the EU regulation isn't prepared to go. So we have higher standards on some things that we feel are particularly important. And I think it's good to have that energy pushing on and saying, right, okay, we need to still improve in this area. And that framework allows us to do it.
In relation to the farmers, the second point. It's a barrier to market having more certification bodies.
I don't see why it is. I think it actually reduces the barrier in many ways because it probably reduces the price. If you've got competition in the marketplace, it usually means that as I say, the price is kept down. That's what we normally see in markets. Whereas if you have a monopoly provider, they can more or less charge what they want. So I don't know that it's a barrier. It may be slightly confusing for farmers to think, who do I want to go with here? So, I think that's, that may be sometimes a complication for folk, but it shouldn't be a barrier.
Quick response on that, Richard?
Yeah, I think I would disagree in that, because they have to make that choice, the farmer, whether they want to be, if they livestock RSPCA or they red tractor or they soil association, and if they want to go through multiple retail outlets, for example, that require certain bodies, then they need to be certified by more bodies. So
yeah, actually, just coming in on that, I think that's a good point in terms of for market access. I mean, I have to have red tractor and RSPCA as well as organic. So what we need to be able to do, and we try to do, is make sure that one provider can provide all of those things. So, and that the more seamless we can make that, so farmers aren't having to have more than one inspection, the better. That should be a really strong push to try and make sure that you can deliver all through 1 or 2 inspections rather than 3 or 4.
Thanks, Richard. Also studying innovation in sustainable food and agriculture is Mark Munzer, I think. You're doing an MBA, Mark.
Yes, good evening. Hello, Helen.
Hi.
My question is organics growing beyond inflation at retail in the UK? And how sustainable is that growth?
So yes, at the moment, organic sales are growing quite rapidly and have been for about the last 7 or 8 years. So I think the market growth this year will be something like 6%. And generally around the world, that is the case. Is it sustainable? Well, that depends on whether we can actually, whether enough farmers will support that market development. And at the moment, I would say there are big opportunities for farmers in the UK, particularly on things like arable, where quite a lot of arable crops are imported, to meet the demand that's growing. Does that answer your question?
Very much so. Nice to see there's a demand, and certainly gives some scope for farmers to upscale their income by changing over.
I'm going to bring in, before I come to the last of the student questions, as it were, I'm going to bring in Jack Rode, MSc in Sustainable Food and Agricultural Policy, MSc. Jack.
Hello, thank you for that. So yeah, my question is, the Soil Association has recently joined the governance team of Regen Agri. Agrimetrics, another member of the Regen Agri team, holds the monetisation of agricultural data as their organisational objective.
Sorry, you said the monetarisation, yes?
Indeed, yeah. In terms of soil-related data, where would you expect to see monetisation, especially in regard to soil carbon sequestration, in which verification can be problematic?
Yes, so there are still challenges around soil in terms of looking at carbon markets and whether soil will be counted, as it were. Trees, most people, when they're thinking about sequestering carbon, they're looking at trees because we know how much carbon they sequester. I think there's a strong case to be made that soils should be eligible for carbon funding. But we do need to make sure we can verify the changes and that we can assure sufficient permanence of those changes so that you don't just kind of sequester it 1 year and then dissipate it the next year. So there's some technical challenges to overcome there, but I think it's going to be very important, given that we know carbon sequestration in soils can lock up carbon faster than it can in trees and vegetation. If you plant a tree, it takes 10 or 15 years before it sequesters much carbon. If you get your act together, it looks as though we can do it much faster, and speed is of the essence with carbon sequestration.
Is there actually a way? Is there a way of measuring that process would allow you to monetize it? Can you look at a sort of 5 years and say, well, this is the amount that is at time t, and this is time t plus 5,
Yes, so I mean, obviously building carbon in soils is not an overnight thing, so you do need to track it over time. There's dispute about which methods of testing are the right ones to use, and this is one of the things that needs to be sorted out, so everybody's comparing apples with apples. And we need to be looking at not just at the amount of carbon in a sort of square metre of soil, but we also need to be looking at the depth of soil and how we're building soils over time. Yes, so there needs to be still some sorting out of the testing and the metrics we're using, but I think there's everything to play for to try and get that right. In other countries, soil carbon is being paid for. So there are schemes now running, and I think it would be great to bring that into the UK, as long as we can do it in a way that isn't snake oil, that is actually where we can be confident about what we're achieving.
Very interesting. David Ebsworth now, you're doing an MBA Innovation in Sustainable Food and Agriculture. David.
Good evening everyone. So my question is, the last 12 years have seen 5 separate government studies on food policy. With the research costing millions of pounds, these 5 separate studies have led to a single policy being implemented, the sugar levy. Now, my question to you, Helen, is if you could give Henry and the team on the National Food Strategy free rein and a similar budget, what policy would you ask him to implement and why?
I should perhaps, for those who don't know, add that the Henry in question has a surname which is identical to mine, and is in fact, he is my nephew. And in a totally unbiased way, I could tell you that he would love to have 12 million pounds to spend implemented in ways that he knew was right. What would you do? You now can instruct him, Helen.
Well, I would turn his 12 million into 120 million a year, I think, by looking not just at sugar, but at the whole issue of ultra-processed food. So in the UK, we consume over half our food as ultra-processed food, compared to something like 14% in France. And there's massive evidence building now that it's one of the reasons why we are unhealthy as a nation. So I would probably get really involved in campaigning against supporting people to move away from ultra-processed food. I would probably start to penalise it financially like we have sugar, so that we had much more money to be using in a positive way to support more sustainable, fresh food being made available at affordable prices in a way that's fair for consumers and for producers.
Have you told my nephew this yet?
I've tried to. I think he's very much on the right page, actually. He's doing some great thinking. And it's been really interesting to be a part of that advisory panel and just see some of that thinking coming through. So yeah, I'm sure you'll get it right.
I hope, we all hope. On to I now open it up to, I know that there are hundreds of people who have been watching and listening to Helen's illuminating wisdom. And we could bring some of those in now. Tom, have you got some questions there to put?
I have, yeah. Thank you. So we've got Matthew Morris and Vicky Robinson, both asked similar points. And they were interested, Helen, that you're a tenant farmer, and we're wondering what landlords could do to encourage tenants to farm in a more regenerative way. And Vicky particularly was wondering how much short-term tenancies and contract farming.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is a real issue, actually. We've moved now to a lot of farms on very short-term tenancies, and it doesn't give much incentive for farmers to think about that long-term husbandry that we were talking about earlier on. So I would say 2 things. One, I'd like to see more longer-term tenancies being offered so that farmers have that investment in their land. But I also think that landlords should be thinking about looking at things like soil quality when tenants go into post, and either dilapidating or paying out on the improvements that they've made during their tenure. So I think that those 2 approaches would really help in that regard.
And what is it, putting it crudely, if the landlord is a landlord who obviously owns and one may assume cares for the land, what is there in it for him or her?
Well, I think the landlord doesn't want to see their land degraded. So they want it farmed in a way which is going to be increasing soil organic matter and soil life and the quality of the soil. So I think that actually trying to make sure that there's an incentive for the tenant to continue to improve the soil during their time on the farm and rewarding them for that is a win-win for both parties.
Tom.
Second question, again, a double-hander. So Ross Cherrington asks how confident you are that ELM's environmental land management scheme is going to work for farmers and the public. And India Grant Wood asks, perhaps slightly more provocatively, along the lines of, if we get ELMs right, then will the need and the market for organic dry up? Any prospect of that?
So confidence on ELMs, I think we're all looking forward to getting a bit more clarity, which I think we'll get in the next few days, about the future of ELMs and how that's starting to shape up. And I think farmers really need that now. I think the premise of public money for public goods is right. But the deliverability of this in the timescales, I hope it'll be all right. But let's see. And actually, the day when we put organic out of business because all of farming is done so well would be jolly marvellous, wouldn't it? If we actually could see all of farming doing the right thing, using minimal pesticides, minimal nitrogen fertilizer, not polluting, loads of great habitat, brilliant soils, I will be thrilled when all of that is in such good shape that organic isn't needed anymore.
Helen, in the meantime, we have ELMs, and public good can embrace any number of sins, a multitude of possibilities. Where would you like to see the emphasis lie in a way that you think will help solve some of the challenges that you've identified in the conversation so far?
Well, I was very pleased that soil was, eventually we got that into the agricultural bill. Because it wasn't there to start with. And I think that we do need to make sure everything does start with the soil. So we do need to make sure we've got those incentives in place and we're really getting those basic things right. I think the habitat, biodiversity, I think three things: whole systems approach. So actually making sure that we're looking at whole farms and driving them towards an agroecological approach. Habitat creation, and particularly joining up habitats so that we create a better network around the country, as was suggested by Lawton all those years ago, so that we actually can start to see that happen. I think if we can create the habitats, farm everywhere well, and look after our soils, if ELMs can help us do that, it will be a brilliant success.
Another question, Tom?
So Emma Jackson asks, points out that there's no mention of rural life or agriculture in the Chancellor's spending review today. Do you think the Westminster government really understands the issues facing rural communities?
I'm not convinced that they do, to be honest. I think it's always been a neglected subject, and there's lots of talk about rural proofing, but it doesn't seem to happen in a very coherent way. Even issues like rural poverty are don't get the airtime they should do. I think one of the interesting things that we did through the Food Farming Countryside Commission was go around the country on a bike and actually talk to folk in rural communities, and really some of the tales and that deeper understanding of what rural communities, how neglected they feel, and some of the issues there are really need the spotlight shone on them far, far more.
Tom again.
Yep. So three people, James Townsend, Andrew Hemming and Colin Dennis, all in various ways, want to know what you make of particularly cultured meat, things that might be to do with biotech or genomics and gene editing and so forth. But it sounds like mainly to do with cultured meat and meat alternatives and maybe growing things from organic stem cells. So have you or the organic movement got a view on that?
So, I mean, if I could take it more generically as some of the kind of, higher tech ways where we could produce food without using land. So precision fermentation, some of the things around algae and fungi and insects. I think this is a really interesting area. There's a lot of money going into these kind of technologies. Some of them I would be more queasy about than others. But I think that they will be very disruptive of what we see happening in farming over the next decade or two. And to some extent, they help, I think, potentially the right ones used in the right way might be able to help us square the circle a little bit without the big shift in diet change that we perhaps would otherwise need to see. Because if we can grow some of our products in vertical farming systems or whatever, then it takes the pressure off the land and allows us to use land for other things as well as food production. So I'm sort of agnostic about some of those technologies. I think we need to investigate them further, but I think some of them will have a role to play, and there's a lot of money going into them.
You are not agnostic, correct me if I'm wrong, however, about another of the technologies, which is A, highly contentious, but B, is increasingly likely to be pressured so far as organic production is concerned, is GM crops.
Yes, no, we think that GM crops have been used in very much the wrong way. They're all around herbicide resistance and insecticide plumbing in insecticides, and 99% of them worldwide are still in that vein. And they've been shown to lead to huge problems from an environmental point of view. So I think we need to be very careful about those kind of sticking plasters, technologies which are not really going back and getting the basics right, which is what organic principles are all about.
Tom, I guess you've got a lot of questions, is that right?
We've got quite a few more.
Okay, before you go to things, we're about 3 minutes. If this was a television or radio program, I would be beginning to wind up to 7 o'clock, and I want to have instruction because we're not. Can we ease on for a few minutes after that, or is that a witching hour? Meanwhile, you put the question while it gets sorted out, and then you can tell me at the end of this question, okay?
Yeah, that's a question from somebody else. I think they'll send you on the chat. So, this question picks up from that point about alternative ways of producing food, and Sue Pritchard links that to the point about organic yields and says we're eating 400 or 500 calories a day more than we should. If we just ate less, would that make the lower yields in organic and regenerative farming less of a concern?
Well, it would certainly help. It would certainly help, wouldn't it? And I think alongside shifting the way we feed our livestock, I think those two things together and reduce our waste, and we could square that circle quite happily. So I hope that all of those things can be in the mix.
Next one, Tom. I got the message, Lisa, thank you.
Okay, got a question about what change is needed, and maybe there's one for us as well as you. What change is needed in agricultural education to bring it into line with the kinds of regenerative approaches you've been talking about? When
I'm going to preempt her answer to a degree. When I was first at what was then the college, it existed. The Soil Association existed. Organic farming existed. It was not part of the curriculum, just like healthcare was not part of the medical curriculum for doctors. I mean, when I say healthcare, health support. When I was most recently there, I was encouraged at your university to see that there was a degree of commitment to exploring the possibilities of sustainable agriculture, organic agriculture. I've been personally hugely encouraged by the quality and character of the questions that we've had so far in this area from a generation which is a long way below mine. But it seems to me there's still an awful long way to go for the institutions to be on the crest of the wave rather than searching to climb to the top of it. I don't want to usurp you, Helen, but I just felt I needed to.
Thank you. Well, I don't need to say anything at all now, but I think I always have felt that actually the kind of techniques we're talking about, basic good husbandry, should be at the core of all the curriculum rather than actually that add-on that you think about another day. I know, I mean, it probably has all changed, and I'd love to get some reflections from you, Tom, or from Joe as to how things have shifted. But I was really taken aback at how hard I had to push when I was doing my degree to be allowed to take this placement doing research on organic farming. But I'm sure it has all changed now, and I'm not close enough to be able to comment properly.
Tom, are you doing what's needed in the best possible way? Tom, you're mute. You've been muted
Sorry,
with shock.
I lost my mute button. The host, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
So I think there's a huge amount going on, and really quite a strong focus on sustainability here at the RAU, but also I think at lots of other institutions as well, and a big focus within that on regenerative approaches as part of the mix. I think like most places we're fairly pluralist when it comes to these things, and that's probably a helpful way to approach it in an educational institution.
Another question. I can take a couple more questions, I think, before we call it a close.
Great. Okay, so one from Tim Barter, who observes that voluntary change is slow, and asks whether, and he mentions the kind of sharp effect that the neonicotinoid ban had.
Sorry, I missed that. I don't know whether Helen, I missed the voluntary change is slow. Can you repeat what happened after that? And
he mentioned how quickly the neonicotinoid ban had an effect on what farmers did. Obviously, an effect that divides opinion. But should government just get in and regulate more?
Helen, should government regulate more?
I think in some cases, regulation is the cheapest and fastest way to get things done. But you do need to make sure that you are providing the solutions that farmers need to move away from whatever you're trying to do. I think the next one was really interesting in that quite apart from farmers shifting what they grew, they also very quickly started to innovate around new ways of growing oilseed rape, work on things like companion planting and all sorts of things they would never have tried if they still had the chemicals to hand. So I think regulation has a strong part to play, but I think you could use fiscal incentives, as we talked about earlier on, alongside that, earlier or as well as, to try and make sure that doing the right thing becomes a no-brainer, and you don't have to regulate quite as often. Regulation is always quite a brutal tool. And there are times when perhaps putting the right incentives and penalties in place financially might be the first route to try.
And one more, Tom.
Okay, and this is a hybrid from John Payne, our chair, and several other people who asked about the John Giles as well, who asked about the future of the organic market. So back to organic with Brexit. US trade deals, and also maybe more lockdown and COVID coming. Just give a sense of the prospects for the market, organic market, over the coming few years.
We've got about an hour and a half, I'm sure. Helen.
So I think the market has been very strong through COVID, which has been interesting. The more people eat at home and eat less out, the more, and people seem to be more focused on health. So a lot of the retailers are, although we're about to hit a recession, which normally wouldn't spell great news for organic, actually this time around they're saying, we think there's been a big shift. There was a lot of interest in these issues beforehand. We've now got a much younger generation who are really buying into organic and really understand it. And so they're confident that this time around the growth will continue, even though we're likely to hit a few economically choppy years ahead. If you look worldwide, demand is strong, and I think that the world on the whole is wanting to trade up. I think the focus on health helps that. And we know in the UK that we will never survive by being the least cost producers. We can't be the least cost producer of virtually anything. So we have to engage in that race to the top. And organic is a really important part of that mix. So I think as a strategy for UK farming, organic is a good hero brand. It's something we should really be relishing and working with and looking for both domestic and export opportunities. So I'm feeling quite positive. If I was going to sit anywhere today and trying to be quite neutral about it, I'd rather be an organic farmer than in lots of other sectors right now. So yeah, I'm feeling confident, but by no means complacent, because that's always a really bad thing.
Helen, thank you. And first of all, thank you very much to all of you who I can see that on my computer here, there's a lot of questions that would have come in. We can't do them all. I hope that we, thanks to Tom and thanks to others and thanks to the students, that we put a lot of the questions that you would have liked to have put yourself. Helen, I've got one more final question to you. Vice Chancellor said at the beginning that she envied your life. Listening to you, it's very clear you could have taken up almost any role in public or private life. You could have been an academic, you could have been a politician, with a bit of luck, you'd have been a serious minister. We need those. I wonder, would you change anything about your life as a farmer and the other things you've done when you look back? It's still, you're only part of the way through, short way through. Would you change anything, or is this what you so glad you had the opportunity and this is what you've done?
I feel hugely privileged to have been able to do what I've been able to do. I think, you know, farming is crazy. It's a crazy thing to do. We also run a pub and a hotel as well. It's another crazy thing to do. But actually, the joy of it all, alongside lots of hard work and the ability to shape something practically, and then in my work at the Soil Association to try and help that become a more widespread thing. I think it's been an amazing, amazing career, amazing life, and I wouldn't have missed it for the world.
How lovely to hear. It's been a joy listening to you. Helen, thank you. And I end my contribution, insofar as it's been one, to this by handing over to Lord Bathurst. Lord Bathurst.
Jonathan and Helen, thank you so much for giving us this incredible evening. And it's a great pleasure for myself to ask to have given you the thanks for this very special Bledisloe Lecture in the 175th year of the college, now university. Just judging by the number of questions that were there, just shows how important this topic is. As a primarily conventional farmer, we're all wanting to be involved in sustainability and to have sustainable farms, but it's very difficult to know as to which direction to turn in. There's obviously the organic route. We've got elms coming down the road. There's no clear direction. Where are we going to get that direction from? And as a result, it's very difficult actually to make those the choices in knowing as to which way to turn. And I think that somewhere along the line, is it government that has got to lead in this role, or is there going to be a market in some form that we are going to be able to follow? And creating that market is going to be the big question over whether it's soils, whether it is carbon, whether it is over all sorts of things, which are so important. We mentioned the possibility of the polluter paying. Now, I couldn't agree more. I think that that's absolutely right. But a tax on nitrogen, is that the right way to go and to do that? Yes, of course it can end up as a pollutant, but on the other hand, it is an extremely important and one might say vital tool for the conventional farming route in order to feed a growing population. There have been so many questions tonight. There have been so many thoughts brought through. It has been an incredibly provoking evening, and I'm sure that it could go well on into the night if we allowed it to do so. But on behalf of the Agricultural University, Jonathan, thank you so much for asking the questions and pummeling poor Helen, who has answered them, I think, extremely well from one end to the other. Very impressed with the questions that the students have asked, and congratulations to all of those. So really, I think just to say thank you once again to you, and also to our sponsors, Owen Mitchell, Creed, and to Savills. Thank you so much to you as sponsors, as without that, we would not be able to hold such a thing as the Bledisloe Lecture. So it's been, I found, a very fascinating and interesting evening, and thank you to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Indeed.
Thank you, everybody. And I just add my thanks to that. It's been the most thought-provoking, challenging conversation. And thanks to all of you for joining in and adding your questions. And so it's hopefully this will be the first of a new format for some of these conversations that we'll be having in future. So good night, everybody, and have a nice evening. And thank you for joining us again. Bye-bye.